All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. I'm Eva. I'm the Education Writers Association Vice President and Education Lab Editor at the Dallas Morning News. Welcome to South by Southwest EDU. We're excited to be here. I know everybody who likes to party this early in the morning on school finance. If you're a nerd, you're in the right place. This is where all the fun stuff is and the cool kids are. So let's talk about how we invest in the future in the long game with student enrollment dropping and fluctuating over the course of the pandemic. We've seen a lot of concerns about how schools are funded and how our educators are adjusting to this influx and trying to meet the needs. So with us today, I have, I have Julien Lafortune, is that her name? Okay. And he is a research fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California. We have Penny Schwinn, Commissioner of Education in Tennessee, formerly a deputy in Texas, so welcome back to Texas.
Thanks.
And we have Michael Griffith, a senior researcher at the Learning Policy Institute.
Good morning.
So Julien, a lot of times we hear, if we hear schools asking for more resources, wanting to help kids learn, address their needs. And on the other side, we hear folks saying, if you just throw more money, it's not going to make a difference. But there's a lot of research out there that does tell us what makes a difference and what doesn't. Can you give us a little bit of an overview about what we're seeing out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to provide a little bit of foundation, it's something many of you are probably aware of. There's been a long-standing debate in the research literature really about whether money matters. There's this question over does money matter? And for a long time, there wasn't really a lot of consensus there. And in part, I think that's because we didn't really have the best data or methods. A lot of times we're looking at correlations, but we know that school funding is driven by a lot of different things. So what do we have now? Over the past decade and a half, we've really had a lot more research go into this question with better data, with better methods, things called, so-called natural or quasi-experiments that really get at the heart of this question. If we give more funding, what do we see in terms of outcomes? And what we found, and it's pretty consistent across studies at least, is that on average, when we give more funding, perhaps unsurprisingly, we see academic outcomes improve, things like test scores, graduation, college readiness, educational attainment. And for the handful of studies that are actually able to look in the long run, what we find is that these investments that we make at a young age actually pay off in terms of greater life earnings, lower incidence of poverty, reliance on the social safety net. We actually see some evidence, there's not a lot of research on this, but it's an emerging topic in terms of reductions in crime as well. And so we've reached a point in the literature, in the research where really, we see, okay, this question of does money matter? Well, it's clear that there's some effect on average, but maybe that's not the most interesting question anyway. One thing I've heard, from people more in the policy sphere is that for a long time, researchers have been centered on this debate, does it matter or does it not? Should we put more money or should we not? When the real question is, how do we target this funding? We have scarce resources, so what's the best way? What gives us the most bang for our buck? What students and schools should we target with the resources? So my hope is, as we kind of move past this question of is the effect zero or not, which is really more of an academic one, research can kind of more address, policy and student needs and really think about these questions of, how can we actually best target it and to which, students, schools, and districts.
So Penny, talk to us a little bit about how Tennessee revamped their school finance. How was the state funding schools previously and what changed last year?
Sure. So for 30 years, Tennessee had the same funding formula, the BEP, and that was a resource-based formula. So essentially, we took the averages from our districts and then kind of calculated that up and provided resource-based apportionments to districts. So you might have a certain amount for instructional supplies or for CTE transportation. It wasn't prescriptive, it still wasn't a spending plan, but it did tell districts how we expected them to use the money. So they did take that as a signal in terms of how they then spent the money locally. What we found was, number one, it was not equitable for all of our students. It certainly was not equitable for the students that we knew needed more support. So you think about economically disadvantaged, students with disabilities in particular. And so we moved to a student-based formula last year called TISA or TISA or TISA or whatever you want to call it, as long as we get the $1.1 billion. So we moved to that, and what that did is so it's a student-based formula. It moved into 4 parts. So essentially we have a base. It's one of the highest bases in the country. It's $6,860 per student for any student, no matter where they live. And that we made it that high because it essentially took our old formula and then added $125 million for teacher salaries. We then created weights, and that was, I think, the biggest component of the change. And so essentially, if you're a student with disability, and we include students with characteristics of dyslexia as part of those weights, you are then able to have additional funding. We increased that funding by about 20%. We have English learners in that category as well. Economically disadvantaged, concentration of poverty, those are very different. We wanted to make sure the students were served, but if you have that concentration in a school where the student attends, that had an additional weight. And then we also had sparse and small. What we found is that in a resource-based formula, if you are a very small district, and the majority of our country are rural small districts, then you actually benefit from the statewide average. And so we didn't want to penalize those very small districts. And so if you're in a small district, less than 1,000 students, which is about 50% of our districts in the country, majority are rural, then you also got a 5% weight, a 5% weight if you were sparse. The last piece, though, was really about direct funding. And so you have a state share and you have a local share for any funding formula. What we found is that that increases taxes. So every time the state wanted to put more money into a formula, you would then increase local taxes, and it prevented greater investment in public education. So we created this direct funding line, and essentially what it is it's state only. Districts do not contribute to that part of the formula. So we put money in. It's not a spending plan, but it does provide additional funding for CTE. So now we fully fund all CTE or economic development programs in our public schools, as well as literacy efforts in particular. That's something that is a very significant focus in Tennessee. And we're adding some additional line items for things like teacher salary increases. The last thing we did was on outcomes. As a state, we really wanted to make sure, and I think to the point that was made earlier, it's not just more money, but are you actually using those dollars in a way that is producing outcomes? Are we measuring return on investment? Are we holding people accountable to saying, if we're giving you a $1.1 billion increase in state funding, which is over 20% more state dollars, are we going to get better outcomes for kids? And specifically, are we going to get better outcomes for kids that have not progressed or grown at the rate that we should be expecting of our public schools and of ourselves? And so we have an outcomes formula that's tied for all grade levels. Elementary school, it's specifically tied to literacy. Middle school, it's tied to growth. For math and reading, we want students to grow in both. And then in high school, it's tied to post-secondary outcomes. Are we getting kids prepared for life after high school with early post-secondary opportunities, college credits, industry certifications, and credentials? And that is a very significant increase. So if you are a kind of a student, any student, you get about 20%, but if you are a student with a disability, a student who's economically disadvantaged or an English learner, you get double the percent increase of the base. So you think about a high school student, they might be getting $1,500 more. The district might be getting that much more if that student earns 2 post-secondary credits by the time they graduate. So we're really trying to incentivize the outcomes. And the last thing that I'll say is that that's the formula. It's really exciting. It's a huge investment. It's the biggest recurring investment we've ever seen in the state. We also had the biggest one-time investment with $500 million to redesign high school and middle school so that districts had that initial seed funding to then maximize their funding formula money. But none of that mattered unless we had transparent reporting and engagement. And so from an engagement process, we had 18 subcommittees over a 4-month period. We did over 150 legislative meetings. We also did community town halls across the entire state, over 100 of those, all told, literally to get as much public feedback as possible. And what that's allowed is a lot of transparency in terms of how we're reporting on this. So we're not just going to say, here's dollars in, here's how much you spent. We're actually going to be telling parents, this is how much your child generated for what services and supports. This is how much your school generated with your students. And this is how much your district spent on that school. Because what we know and what we found from our districts, and they're being, I think, very open about that, is squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so you have high income schools that are funded at a much higher level than what they are generating. And we've got a lot of schools who need a lot more support that are not getting all their funding. So now if I'm a parent, for the first time, I will see that my school generated $4 million in funding, and I will know exactly how much the district spent on that school and how much they kept at the district office. When we talk about equity and what matters for kids, it's not just what comes in, it's how it is spent and on what. And I think for the first time, Tennessee will actually be able to provide that level of transparency for our taxpayers and our parents.
Now, school finance can be really wonky, really hard to grasp. There's maybe like 4 or 5 people in each state that really understand school finance, and probably all of them are in this room. So What are we seeing as far as the appetite to really make any kind of investments or long-term changes? And what's the trend out there now as we're talking about funding schools on enrollment versus attendance? Is there any kind of big overarching themes that you're seeing there, Michael?
Well, that's a lot for 3 minutes. And I also want to apologize. I'm not shaved. I'm not trying to be hip because it's South by Southwest. I just didn't bring a razor. So we've seen a sea change. I've been working in school finance at the national level for over 20 years now. And the argument in the beginning was to people, we do need to put more money into high-need student populations. And that's where it started. People now accept that. So when I say high-need student populations, that would be special education students, English language learners, students who are at risk. We've kind of moved on to the next level now. People accept that, but we're talking more about how much funding and then how much does it move the needle. We're also talking more detail about these groups. We used to just kind of lump a lot of kids together in the at-risk category, but we realize now that there are subgroups within that category that have very different needs. So at-risk used to just be low-income kids, but we talk about those kids as needing support, but also students experiencing homelessness, needing a lot more support, foster youth, needing a lot more support, migrant students, needing more support. Each of those should be thought about as different groups within your funding formula as you move forward, and we're hearing more and more states doing it. But, for instance, we had a paper that came out this week talking about state funding for students experiencing homelessness. There are only 4 states that currently provide additional funding for that group. The other 46 do not. So it's the realization is there, but it's trying to get states to move forward. I know in your state, for instance, it took years to go from the idea of wanting to change the formula to finally changing it. You all were able to get that, put the extra money in, get the momentum going, bring in people to do it, but it is a very difficult thing to do. As far as, I'll do it really quickly, the difference of measuring for funding purposes students by attendance versus enrollment is a huge issue now. My guess is you're all hearing it in your states. The trend for years was to move to attendance, because the feeling was we should only pay for the kids who are attending, and if kids drop out halfway through a school year, that we shouldn't pay 100% of that kid, we should only pay half for that student. Because of COVID, and because not every student physically attends school every day, some attend virtually, some kids are moving, we're seeing a huge fluctuation in students attending physically in schools. We're seeing more and more states looking at least for the short term, moving to enrollment over attendance. So enrollment simply says if the student is enrolled in the school and they don't signify that they have dropped out, then we as the state will continue to fund them for that position. Whereas attendance literally means if the kid misses 20% of the days, you're only going to give them 80% of the funding. So we did see the trend in one way, now we're seeing it in another way nationally.
So we talk a lot about the research and what the research shows. Are the policymakers listening to the research? Is that showing up in the moves that we're seeing as far as policy that gets passed? Do we see outcomes that are really tied to these dollars really play out in the long run?
Yes. Yes, it is. And, it's one of those things, and we struggle with it in our field. Like, how do we take the really good research that is done, but explain it to people in really concrete ways? Our field tends to produce these reports that are 150 pages long. We need to boil them.
We love those as reporters.
Yeah. But we need to boil them down right to 2 pages, and without losing what was in the report itself. But I will say more and more, when I talk to policymakers, they say, where is the proof? It's less the rhetoric, it is more the proof that is there. And some of these things are a little harder to prove. We don't have as much as direct information, but we can compile an awful lot now. And as you were saying earlier, Julien, there's more and more on this that we can show to people. And the longer it goes, the better longer-term results we can show that this is a great investment for you. Very often, too, policymakers want to hear the whole, for every dollar I invest, I get $5 back. And early learning has been able to do this in a great way. That's one of the reasons why we've seen early learning explode across the country. They've had some really good numbers that they can go right to policymakers and say, if you do this, then you're going to see this. It's a little harder with things like after school or summer learning. It might not necessarily have that direct, for every dollar you invest, you're going to get this return.
So, Penny, what do you think was the turning point for Tennessee to really kind of grasp this and get the momentum to get this across the finish line for them?
Yep, so as a state, we had years, I think, of kind of trying to push for some kind of funding reform. And that really, was kind of especially in the 2014 to 2018 time period. And it would move, that we would have a year of every month there's gonna be a committee, someone's gonna talk about it, and then we're gonna feel good about it, and then nothing happened. About a year before, the governor and I had a good conversation, and it was you get one shot at it, and so just like go big or go home. And so we talked to legislators. We did not have the votes in the spring before. We did not have the votes in the summer, and we did not have anywhere close to the votes when he announced it in October before the session. And so what we decided on that was going to get momentum is saying, look, we have a great economy in Tennessee. We can actually invest enough and make a commitment that no district would get less than they had the year before. That is not forever, because if you have declining enrollment, then we'll stair step you down to right size, but we're not going to fund you at this arbitrary level forever. And we thought we could have a really robust public engagement process that wasn't just for show, but was actually saying, let's take the ideas of all of these different communities, bring them in and say, look, we put some stakes in the ground. We are going to do student-based funding. We are going to do, X, Y, or Z. But all the stuff in the middle, we're going to cede to what Tennesseans want. And we stuck by that. And we did a lot of public engagement, a lot of testimony and hearings, and it's knowing your stuff backwards and forwards, ultimately. To the policymaker component, we had a lot of policymakers, as they shouldn't, to be fair, really understand the difference between a resource-based and student-based funding formula. That's not what they were elected to do. They were elected to better understand it and ask really hard questions, and they did that for 24 plus hours of hearings. But I think that there was a lot of investment in breaking down complex pieces of information into bite-sized chunks that anyone could understand at different levels. It was really about saying, what are the priorities? Let's fund the big buckets and not worry about the kind of small grain size work. Let's make commitments to funding certain things like teacher salary increases over time. Governor just announced that we'll get to $50,000 as a minimum salary in Tennessee, which in Tennessee is huge. It'll be a top 5 minimum salary in the country. We couldn't do that in the formula, but we could do that after. So it's kind of the proof point over and over that we're committed to that level of engagement. All that being said, it is just about, do you have enough money? Can you make commitments about the return on that investment? Can you link it to outcomes? And ultimately, if I am a legislator, do I trust that if I'm going to put this much money in, I'm going to see a better Tennessee 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road? And do I believe the people that are saying that? And that's really what it came down to. The desire was there, but it just had to be the right formula at the right time with enough people, rural, urban, and suburban, who all felt like their kids were going to benefit. And it had to be about kids. We did not talk about adults at all. Not that I'm not interested. I think adults are wonderful, but that's not what a funding formula is for. It's about saying, if I'm a rural kid in Perry County, or I am a student who lives in an urban community in Memphis, or I'm in a suburb that's 20 miles south of Nashville, is my child going to be supported and funded in this formula in a way where they can maximize their potential? And that was the only question we were interested in answering.
Now, a lot of schools across the country got millions of dollars in federal pandemic aid to help bolster student learning and fill in the gaps from all the disruptions that we've had over the last couple of years from COVID-19. What are some of the things that we've seen in terms of how schools have invested that and what kind of outcomes that there have been? And how does that correlate with the research that you've seen?
Yeah, so it's a bit early on the outcome side. A lot of the spending is still going on. In a lot of, I can at least speak for what we're finding in California. We're about 60% or so through the federal stimulus dollars. So there's a lot left, but there's also a lot of time left, and it looks like districts, at least on average, are kind of on track to spend that down. And so what have we seen when we've looked into the spending patterns? At least in California, and I think this is probably pretty similar nationally, but in the first year and a half, a lot of it was health and safety oriented, so things like masks, PPE, testing, contact tracing, and then also a lot of technology spending, so laptops, devices, internet and Wi-Fi connectivity for students, and so there was a big investment in that initially, and so a lot of that is really just around distance learning. And then kind of as we've gone on, we've seen, relatively more spending, relatively less on those categories, and relatively more on categories like instructional interventions, things to target learning losses, mental health and social emotional learning supports, additional instructional time. But one of the big constraints we're seeing with some of those is that it's hard to find staff, right? And so these are one-time funds that have an expiration. And it's a hard it's a hard labor market in general. It's a very tight labor market in the economy, and that's certainly true when it comes to education and educators. And so it's very difficult for districts to, spend this money down if it requires, programs that have interventions that may require permanent staffing. And so what we've seen, anecdotally at least, is there are a lot of districts that have relied on more kind of contract work or additional services contracted through nonprofits, and even some districts that have gone ahead and hired full-time staff that are kind of, that they expect to pay for in the future and hope that in 2 or 3 years it'll work itself out and that there'll be some political momentum there. So that's a risky strategy, but that's also, that's something that districts are doing as well.
So Penny, can you talk to us a little bit about this funding cliff for when the pandemic aid runs out and how Tennessee is bracing for it? Like, how have y'all spent your pandemic aid money and how are you bracing for the expiration of it?
Yeah, and I think I would say Tennessee's story is a little different. We do not expect a fiscal cliff, and frankly, the expectation is that when we put things into place for kids, and we were very clear with districts, and our districts have been doing a very good job, is that do not fund this as one-time funding. Think strategically about how you use this one-time funding for long-standing, sustainable impact. And that's that three-legged stool of do you have the money, do you have the policy, do you have the implementation? All three of those have to be in place. So from the beginning, we worked the strategic plan that we had. The data wasn't different. We still had kids who couldn't read on grade level en masse. We still had significant gaps in our post-secondary attainment for our high school students. And so we really said we're going to focus on literacy, we're going to focus on acceleration, which is tutoring and summer programming. We're going to redesign middle school and high school, and we're going to make it as close to possible for becoming a teacher for free and getting paid to do so. And that is what we did. We incentivize districts, your best for all districts, our strategic plan's best for all. But if districts committed 50% of their funds to academic recovery and they did high dosage tutoring, then we would give them incentive grants. We'd process their paperwork faster. They got to sign up for things. We did bureaucracy removal. So really incentivize that change. The majority of our districts are best for all districts. And so what we have found is that we have, for literacy, Reading 360 is our process or our implementation arm. We had policy in 2021 to restructure how we did literacy in the state. So we have funding, we have a permanent policy that is now in place forevermore, and we have really strong implementation from the state. For the acceleration work, we did the same thing for tutoring and summer school. We will now have summer school funded for every rising kinder through rising ninth grade student in the state forevermore, not funded through the formula, but funded through state dollars and federal dollars. And that we've had 22 to 25% attendance of all students in the state. Really high attendance. We do not see shortages in teachers because we're paying our teachers well. We are allowing them to split the summer in half. We are using teacher candidates. We are using retirees. We're using career changers to help with licensure requirements, things like that. We have this investment in terms of the $500 million, again, all state dollars, not federal recovery dollars, to redesign middle and high school. Every middle school got $500,000, every high school got $1 million to restructure their programs. So now we have students who are coming into their high school programs already taking CTE classes, going into college with credits. And then we have the first federally approved apprenticeship so that teachers can now be apprentices. So if you are a teacher in Tennessee or want to be a teacher, we can now use federal dollars to fund your tuition, your books, your materials, your childcare, frankly, if your car breaks down, anything like that. And so again, leverage those federal dollars, not for one-time expenses, but to say, how do we invest in the things that are going to help Tennessee in the long term? Those are now all off the ground, and we have permanent state dollars with a new funding formula that is exactly what we got in federal dollars. We got $4.5 billion, which is about $1 billion per year. We now have that in our new funding formula. So we will not see a fiscal cliff. What we are doing is saying, measure your return on investment, continue to fund what works, stop what isn't working, and then make sure that you're getting the outcomes for kids.
So Michael, we have a room full of mostly reporters. What are the school finance stories out there that you wish someone would cover that you think is not being covered enough? Or if you were an assigning editor and you're like, this is a thing everyone needs to geek out on.
Wow, that's deep. I would say, there's a lot of things out there. I'm less worried about the federal money than I think a lot of other people in the field. People have been told about this. There's been a lot of conversations about it. There will be a couple of school districts. There are 13,800 school districts. Some of them will not be spending the money correctly. It's just the odds, right? But the vast majority are, and they've been warned and they know the money runs out. What I'm more worried about is the economic trends and what will state economies look like in the next year or two. If we have this money running out, which it is, and we have a dip in the economy, then we could start seeing some issues. And we really don't know where the economy is heading right now. The other one that really worries me, and I've had a lot of conversations, is recruiting and retaining teachers right now is a huge issue. 60 to 65% of education spending goes to teacher salaries and benefits. We're having a harder time in public education bringing those people in and keeping them in. So some of that is funding, some of that is a lot of the other issues that are there. But to me, that's a real worrying issue. That's always been an issue, and I think that's why people might not be focusing in on it as much. But when you look at the pipeline, it is really drying up. The number of young people who are choosing to go into education. And we have a shortage now, and unless something changes, those shortages are going to get even worse. And without teachers, we're really stuck. They are education, right? That's the thing that worries me. But also, I'm worried about everything all the time anyway, so you got to take that with a grain of
Can
salt.
I add one to that? I agree with Mike on both of those. One that I'll add that gets some attention, but I don't think gets as much attention as maybe as it deserves, are school buildings and school facilities. So when we talk about school funding, there's been a lot of progress in terms of more equitable funding, more progressive allocations, right, to high-need populations. But that's all kind of on the operational side. So when you look at school funding for facilities, it's still largely, and in most states overwhelmingly, based towards this local property tax system. And we know that that creates these inequities. We've seen those in all sorts of other school funding outcomes. And then on top of that, some states even have kind of matching grant programs that actually tend to exacerbate that. So in California, one thing we found is that the matching grants, at least for modernization and not new schools, actually exacerbate these existing inequities, based mostly on local property wealth. And there's a lot of need. In general, I think it's not super controversial to say we're bad at investing in things that require big upfront dollars that have payoffs over 30, 40, 50 years, in this country, perhaps increasingly so. But there's a lot of need that's kind of pent up in school districts, and that can really crowd out a lot of spending on current needs, on teachers and other staff, and can affect, student outcomes as well as morale for educators and staff.
All right, let's start opening this up to questions, and we have some microphones up here, and as we have folks coming up, one thing that we are hearing a lot about across the country is a lot more vocal conversations about school choice, school voucher-like programs. What are we seeing in terms of those kind of discussions and debates across the country? I know Tennessee, that's a very much alive and well over there.
Yes, well, so then I will jump in. I think Tennessee back in 2019 passed its first ESA bill, which had a whole litigation process, and it was implemented this year. I think what's been interesting over the last 6 months is that nationally you're seeing an escalation in a very specific group of states related to school choice, and that does seem to be as a result of the pandemic, and I think families looking for options. Now that doesn't have to just be private school. I think in terms of the reporting and the prior question, how do we think about what the new expectation is of education? It are things like, does my child have work-based learning opportunities? Is my student being set up to be reading on grade level by third grade, no exceptions, and ideally significantly earlier than that? Third grade's like your end point of when you want to get there. Does my student, I have 3 kids, 2 are in public schools in Nashville, very different girls, very different. They probably will not need the same thing in their education. They will need something a little bit different. One is a disability, one doesn't. One's sporty, one's artsy. I, as a parent, would love to have opportunities within Nashville public schools to be able to find the exact right fit for each of my girls. And so when we talk about school choice, I think there is something much broader. It is not just, are you pro or anti-voucher? Are you pro or anti-public charter school? But what is it that we want and should expect for each of our individual students, and how do we create an education landscape and environment that is flexible enough to address and account for the needs of all of our very, very different kids in this country. And I think the last thing I would say is that we have to embrace change and not fight it. And so as an education system, when we talk about technology, it's not just putting a computer in a classroom. How are we thinking about AI? How are we thinking about kind of what we all know is going to be the next phase, and help our public schools get to a place where they are innovating just like any other sector, so that families can see all of the different opportunities and options that are available, regardless of where the parent chooses to send his or her child and which school that might be. But it is ultimately the parent's decision.
Hello, my name is Joe, and I'm from Oregon. My last name is Rowe, like row your boat, Joe, row your boat. And I'm a teacher, and 1 year I did teach journalism, and it humbled me because I realized students might write complete sentences, but they really lack variety. And I had a volunteer from the Oregonian come in, and she turned my students into the best writers in the school, just random kids that got journalism. So I really honor all the journalists in this room, and I'll hang out in the back because I'd love to talk to you one-to-one. I have a side agenda. My question for you, and I resonate with everything you said, like the intellectual power in this room is amazing, especially what you said about school funding. I wish Oregon had transparency in funding. We don't. So thanks to all the panelists for being here. And we don't have research methods in Oregon, like you started out talking about research methods. Incredible stuff that I could talk about. But my question goes to, you posed the question to the gentleman. I forgot your name. Your name?
Mike.
Mike, you answered the question as like the two untold stories are retaining teachers and some other topic that I forgot. But for me, what journalists are not doing is they are not coming to unions and talking to us. I feel journalists are biased. They have a clickbait goal, and I don't see a lot of corrections. Like, my worry in journalism isn't what we're not reporting, it's we are not correcting the bias in our media. And during COVID, I saw tons of lies by the New York Times. They said HVAC in schools is not important, quote, not important. And they also said that kids predominantly catch COVID from adults. Emily Oster, who's funded by Walton, pro-charter. I mean, you said it doesn't matter whether you're pro-charter or not charter. I agree. But where we disagree is that the pro-charter people, they have money, and they get space on the headlines.
Do you have a question for
Yeah, so the question is, why police look the other way when there's a bad cop? They look the other way, which makes kind of all cops bad cops because they're an accessory to the crime. Journalists look the other way. So what is the EWA, and what do you think as educators, you're all educators because you're in this room, what can we do to undermine the bias in the media?
Well, I'm not sure that I follow that line of thinking, but like,
Well, you don't have to agree with me, but let's just agree that there is bias. What can we do to lower it?
I think everyone approaches their stories from their own experiences, but the key to telling great stories is to get out and talk to other folks and, record their experiences and talk about, like, our job is not to be a cheerleader for anyone, and our job isn't to attack anyone. It's to go out there and tell the most accurate stories that we can for the public.
Hi, I'm Taylor McGraw. On the topic of funding formulas, I'm in Mississippi. We also have a funding formula that is supposed to take equity into account and everything, but it's often never fully funded. And so I'm curious, both in Tennessee but also nationally, are there states that have successfully put in like safeguards in the political process to sort of ensure that the formula actually gets fully funded every year? I know it's always like a huge budget fight, it seems like, and becomes very politicized. So I'm just curious, in Tennessee, but also around the country, if you guys know of states that have protected that formula and made sure that it always gets funded.
I'll start. So I think in Tennessee, what's been nice is we haven't had a year where we didn't fund the formula. What I will say, though, is that up until this year with TISA, it has been woefully underfunded. So we've had such little funding that it was quite easy to fully fund. We do have provisions within the law, TISA, that passed that says that the formula as it stands shall be fully funded. If for some reason we go into a significant economic downturn, which again, the state has never experienced, or we don't fully fund the formula as it's calculated, then it's a proportional reduction across the board. I think what we did is, and one of the things that we did to be responsible about that is we went to 3 separate organizations or agencies to do some forecasting to say, if we expect a significant economic downturn or some kind of recession in the next 5 to 6 years, can we still afford to add in what was $1 billion is now going to be about 1.25 billion new state dollars? Because the last thing we want to do is pass this great formula and only fund a proportion of it. So in the governor's budget this year, we ended up not doing $1 billion. Again, it'll be a little bit over 1.1 billion, and we have that projected out through 2030 to ensure that, number one, taxes don't go up locally for at least another 3 to 4 years. They go up locally every year, but we were able to make it so that they actually do not do that. We know we can fund this through at least 2030. We can't project any more than that, but it is the responsibility of the state to engage experts and multiple experts to check your work and ensure that if you're committing to additional dollars for kids, you can maintain that commitment for at least the next decade.
I can add one thing on the California context. So there are pros and cons to this, but one thing, and the politics are, I'm sure, very different than in Mississippi, to say the least. But in California, we have something that's called Proposition 98. So it was voted on by the voters several decades ago. And what it does is it essentially directs 40% of the state budget to K through 12 schools and community colleges. So there's a fixed part of the budget there. So it's served over time to kind of protect the budget, but it comes with a cost too, and that's when there are big budget cuts, then education is almost seen as a kind of a mandatory and automatic cut as well. So the education funding is a little bit more boom and bust, but at least when there are these boom times, and that's kind of what happened when we passed our funding formula, the local control funding formula, which is also a student weighted funding formula. We had these big kind of budget increases coming out of the Great Recession, and that really helped to kind of fully fund the formula. So that's where we've been at in California.
Hello, my name is Alexis Minoguila-Herrick, and I'm with Code.org, Director of Institutional Partnerships. Commissioner Schwinn, nice to see you again. Since Tennessee became one of the latest states to pass a computer science graduation requirement, we've now seen 20 states, including many of your colleagues, commissioners of education, wanting to, in governor's office, wanting to pass similar graduation requirements similar to the model Tennessee did. This isn't so much a question about the formula, but more the strategy as other commissioners, other state chiefs, and governors are thinking about this. The way Tennessee went about their teacher training, because to scale this model, you have to train teachers to be able to teach this new core subject area. What Tennessee did, my understanding, was create free, nothing's free, no cost, professional development for teachers. How were you able to create such a model where teacher training for such an important new subject for a core was able to happen, and what were the political challenges? And I would just love for you to share if there's anybody in the audience who's looking at scaling that to maybe adopt the Tennessee model.
Yeah.
Sorry, gentlemen, I don't have any questions for you.
No, thank you. I don't get to talk about computer science as much, so that's wonderful. So last year, lesser known, but we did have a pretty omnibus computer science bill pass, where essentially it's now required that every student grades K through 12 receives computer science instruction every day, or at least the average of a certain period of time every day, and it's now a graduation requirement, amongst many other things. What we found is that the majority of our teacher workforce, including our ed prep programs, did not have the content to be able to actually train teachers, did not have the coursework, or didn't have the structures. So we partnered with an outside organization, TSIN. They actually do a lot of our work related to STEM designated schools. And so we took a chunk of money, and the political kind of navigation of that was really about saying, number one, if our kids are not proficient in computer science, and we have that broad, we also include data science in that, literacy, math, et cetera, then they will not be competitive with surrounding states or internationally. And so it was a value proposition. We spent about 8 months building that value proposition of what kids need to know and be able to do. We started with literacy, we have math, we have computer science as super core components. Then by partnering with a third-party organization, we're not having 6 or 7 different vendors who are all doing little things across the state, but we have a unified approach where this is our expectation about quality professional development. This is the experience our teachers deserve to have as professionals. And this is an organization that we trust where we're still able to support the quality of that. And so that was a $10 million investment. And that will now be part of all of our ed prep programs. And it also ensures that we are educating and supporting and developing thousands of teachers every year. And it's been super exciting. It's Reach Them All is what it's called. And it's all free. We do open source for anything that's taxpayer dollars. And so you're welcome, anyone's welcome to have whatever it is we build or develop. Yep. Good to see you.
So very happy to be school finance geeking out here, and I'm a little hesitant to out myself. I am a school board member from Washington State, so anyway, great conference. I am here in 1975. Congress passed the Individuals with Disability Education Act. At that time, they made a commitment that they would fund up to 40% of the costs. The most they've ever done is 17%, and they're currently back at 10%. And my district alone, we spend $20 million outside of our state and federal funding on students with IEPs. So for 48 years times 365 days, that's how many times we have gone to Congress and said, please, it's the morally right thing to do to fund the costs of this. I think we've gone beyond the definition of insanity on that point. What else should we be doing to get Congress to step up and fund this morally right thing? Is there data out there, to your point, that shows the rate of return on investment? Is there other states, are there states out there that are starting to come up with ideas suing? I mean, what else do we need to be doing to get them to fund this?
So this is going to sound counterintuitive. But what I've been trying to tell people, because I tried that argument for years, you're absolutely right. When you look at the numbers, it's not anywhere close to what they said they promised the funding. Some will say 10%, some will say 15%, but it's not close. The argument then is, right, well, they're not funding these things. The counter argument I was hearing from people, well, they're still getting their education. Students are guaranteed, students have an IEP, are guaranteed this education, and they're getting it. What I found to be a more effective argument lately is to say what you don't realize is if you don't fund special ed, the money's coming from somewhere, and that's coming from general ed kids. Mm-hmm. And so when you're properly funding special ed, you're actually properly funding general ed. That you're forcing districts to rob from Peter to pay Paul. So that seems to be a little more effective argument. We have tried explaining it to people at the federal level, and there just is not the traction there, and I don't know enough about lobbying. We don't lobby as an organization, but we inform people. I don't know enough about that, but we've tried to put things out at LPI. When I worked at the Education Commission of the States, we tried to put information out there. I wrote a paper about this that I think was read by 3 people. And so, it's there, and everyone gets it. And I think in some way, this is one of the most frustrating things I've seen in school finance in my career is everyone gets it. Everyone says, yes, it's underfunded. Everyone says it's a shame that it happens, and then no one does anything, And even now, when all of this extra money was coming in to public education, which is the largest single investment of federal dollars ever in education, IDEA really didn't get a look at that. And so, yeah, I think one of the reluctant things is they feel if they put more money in IDEA, then they have to keep doing that for eternity, because states technically do. So if you're a state and you provide additional funding, you're locked into that. So I feel your frustration. I'm trying to think of better arguments. If you all have better arguments, I'd love to hear them, but it's still there and it's still an issue.
Hi, my name is Monica. I'm a special education middle school teacher in Oklahoma. And so hearing about what you guys were talking about was just really exciting, especially because I teach at a school that's like over 90% students of color, over 95% of them live below the poverty level. And so the idea of like the type of structural funding that you guys like came up with is really exciting. However, I live in Oklahoma. And so I like the idea of a bill like that is just so, or like some sort of structure around that is just so far beyond what I right now feel like is possible for Oklahoma. And so I guess my question is just like, what kind of thematic arguments against increasing funding or funding specifically for vulnerable populations of students did you receive, and like how did you kind of best combat those, or like get people to understand that like it is, well, maybe you didn't get them to understand that it's the morally right thing to do, but you had some sort of economic argument.
So you had 100% support, right?
I was like, ooh, who wants to answer that? No, it was really hard, right? And so, because part of it's change, and so I'll actually use English learners as the proxy example there. So as a state, Tennessee did not have essentially a reportable number or percent of English learners for the NAEP, or the national assessment. We had a very, very low population. Over the last 5 to 10 years, that population has increased significantly, and it trends like how you might see something in Georgia, so we're following those trends. I'm using that because that was a new kind of growing population within the state, which is different than like students with disabilities. We did not get a lot of pushback on that. It was much more about high expectations, outcomes, et cetera. For English learners, we had a very low level of funding. We did not have anything tiered, so it was every student, whether you're a first year or a sixth year, was getting the same funding, and we actually didn't have a lot of additional supports, et cetera. And so being able to talk through the economic argument of that, where we are all Tennesseans, regardless of which part of the state you live in, regardless of whether you've been here for 1 minute or your entire life, we are Tennesseans working on this together. And here's what happens. And what we did that I think was probably more compelling is we actually just told the story of individual students behind closed doors. Sometimes they were, fake or fictitious students, but it was like, let's follow this child. This is their first day in pre-K. And here's what their experience is. And here's where statistically this child will be when they graduate high school, 4 years after, 8 years after. Now imagine a world in which we can provide this level of support and funding. Here's what the research says. Now let's travel down the path of that student with a completely different level of supports. But that personalization was really important for individual legislators. What I will say from a process perspective is you have to invest the time. You can't create a video or a one-pager that everyone reads and is like, oh, now I want to fund. It really is about having meeting after meeting after meeting with the same person and having them understand that this might not be what your world is. It might not be what your community is or how they are represented, but it is still someone that we are all responsible for, and it's somebody's community, and ultimately we all benefit when everybody rises. It was really hard though, and it was very, very, there were a lot of uncomfortable conversations regardless of political affiliation, because not everybody agreed. What we passed, I think people agreed fundamentally that all kids, regardless of where they are from, deserve an excellent education, and we have to fund as much. And so that was our basis, and then it was just talking.
Hi, my name is Emily Tate Sullivan. I'm a reporter at EdSurge, and I am also a product of Tennessee Public Schools. So Michael identified one of the biggest stories as attracting and retaining teachers. And Penny, you said that you guys don't have a teacher shortage in Tennessee because you are paying them, I don't know exactly what you said, enough. I'm curious what is enough and how you determine that, like in your unique context and cost of living and all of that. And what could other states, other places learn from that, and how could they emulate it? Because it would be pretty remarkable if something's happening there that other people could learn from.
Yeah, so to clarify, we don't have shortages in our summer programming. So for our summer school, no teacher shortages. We had enough teachers in. For our teacher shortage numbers, we have not seen an increase through the pandemic. I think there's been a lot of news about growing teacher shortages. We actually didn't see that. We've been hovering in terms of vacancies right around 1,000 teachers for the last 5 or 6 years. For the first time though, over the last 2 years since we started our Grow Your Own and apprenticeship programs, we're actually seeing that our larger universities have an uptick in the number of teacher candidates for the first time in a decade. So our University of Tennessee system is now seeing a really significant double-digit % increase in the number of folks who are enrolling in that program. Our Grow Your Own program has now 500 future teachers in it, which cuts our vacancies in half Now that we have our apprentices, we have 250 just in the first year. We're now in our second year, and we have several hundred who are coming in. And so part of what we've done to address that is we figured out what the barriers were. Number one, financial barriers to entry, especially for future teachers of color and low income, or had an economically disadvantaged kind of background. They just couldn't afford to pay tuition, or if they were career changers, they just couldn't afford to just not get paid for however many years and support their kids, pay their rent, get their mortgage done, whatever it might be. So we wanted to remove financial barriers. The second is great, now I get my degree. I have much better support because I have 3 years of mentorship under this apprenticeship program as opposed to just kind of diving in on the first day and hoping it works out. And so now we've addressed the second problem, which is preparation. So I have 3 years in a classroom with a mentor or master teacher. I don't have financial debt, and now it's my first day of school. Totally different ballgame. But then how do we get teachers to stay? We know the magic numbers. If we get teachers to stay for 5 years, they are more likely to retain over time. But we also want to make sure that we're valuing them and treating them like professionals. It's not just getting to an endpoint and then hoping it works out. And so part of that was income, and that was the $50,000 minimum that the governor has proposed this year. The second was around school environment and instructional leadership. And so that's a whole other strand that we've been working on, which is aspiring assistant principals, aspiring district instructional leads. We have networks for each of those because we know as a teacher, I am more likely to stay if I love what I do, and that's easy. I mean, who doesn't love being a teacher? It's the best hard job ever. The second is, am I paid enough to support my family? And then the third is, am I in an environment where I feel and am treated like a professional and know that I can be successful? So we've kind of tried to do all three of those prongs in order to get the vacancy rate to drop, but also ensure that retention is high and we are keeping our very beloved and needed and important veteran teachers.
Yeah, and as reporters, it's very interesting to cover teacher issues, right? Because it's a very nuanced situation where it's not, you don't have shortages across the board in all areas, right? It's very nuanced depending on your location, depending on the area. And so in terms of school finance and looking at it, like it's really interesting to see what's going out there across the states when they're discussing minimum salaries, when they're discussing different teacher pipelines and retention issues. Like Texas recently just came out with the teacher task force report that had a number of months. The governor appointed some folks from across the state to really look at what some of the teacher issues are and came up with some interesting recommendations there. So it is definitely something that is being approached state by state.
Thank you.
That is such a great topic. I would love to keep talking about that. I'm Barbara Cannon, and I'm a former school board member from Arlington, Virginia. And first, I just want to thank you so much for having this conversation. School finance is the most important topic when it comes to education, and probably, despite as many people are in this room, it is probably the least discussed and absolutely the least understood. And there are two obvious reasons for that. One is we don't have a federal education system. We are state by state. It is not constitutionally mandated federally. It's mandated in our states. And so every funding formula is different, every approach to education. We are actually competing with each other. You're taking teachers perhaps from other states, and so, we don't, but that's just it. So I want to argue that despite everything you're talking about and, states that fully fund their formula and adders for students with higher, the highest needs, we still have an extraordinarily inequitable education system, and it is based on the inequities that already exist in our country, and we will never get out of it until we have some way of a more equitable approach. And I'll just give the straightforward example from my own state, and I think any state could be an example of this. I'm from Virginia. We are a fairly wealthy state nationally. We are 41st in state funding for education. It's about $5,000 per pupil at the state level. But any state, whether you're fully funding your formula or not, probably allows for and has local districts funding themselves, supplementing that state funding with our property tax revenues. So in Arlington, Virginia, we spend $23,000 per student, and we have divisions in our state that spend less than $10,000 per student. That is a straight up inequity based on the fact that Arlington has higher home values, people with higher incomes, things like that. So I know this is just the problem of our time, but I would love to hear any comments you have on how you're thinking about your work and how we can actually work toward actual equitable funding for every single student within our states and then across the country.
Well, I know there's some concern about that as y'all were talking about the debates in Tennessee, right? Because there's some concerns about how this shift to local funding will shift over time to local folks picking up more of the tab. What is the conversation going like there in terms of the shift of local and state?
Yep, so in Tennessee, we use two different calculations that are averaged together, but it is sales tax, property tax. It's no different than the majority of states. The governor said if we're going to do this, the only requirement is that we do not increase local taxes, period. So what we did is we used some of the additional state funding to compensate for what locals would have put in, and that's why we moved part of the formula that was shared with locals to just state only. And so that gives everyone approximately 3 to 4 years minimum before they hit their maintenance of effort requirements and have to start increasing. Under our old formula, every year you increased. What I will say about that were pretty robust conversations is that we do have what we call local contribution and local share. Our wealthier districts do put in more than our less wealthy districts. We've got some rural districts where there is no industry, there's no economy. There literally is not there's not a road. Like that is like the big thing. There's no like kind of 4-lane road. They just can't put in. They don't have the tax base. What we did not do, though, is limit how much locals could add on top. And I think that's what you're speaking to. There's a very wealthy district. It might be one of the wealthiest districts in the country, just south of Nashville. They put in a tremendous amount on top of the state funding formula. We had robust conversations about literally you drive 10 miles south, and I'm going to go from one of the lowest performing schools and frankly lowest funded in the state to one of the highest. And that is an inequitable situation for those children if the parents don't have the option to move and do whatever. We don't really have a way to solve for that, because what we don't want to do is say locals just don't put any more money in education because this other community can't. Like that doesn't feel right either. And so what we did is we said, what is the amount that we believe must be true for all kids no matter what, and not as a group, but individual students. What is that minimum amount? Where do we want to take it to? And if you want to have a community garden and an amphitheater and gold-plated chairs in your school and you want to fund that locally, that's fine. We don't think that's necessary for an adequate education. We just need adequacy to be defined at a much higher level than it has been.
Michael, has anyone figured out that magic
No.
balance?
Michigan has come the closest, but it was by accident. Michigan, it's a very convoluted thing, but they temporarily passed a law that said no property taxes can be used for education. This was back in '93. They realized that wasn't going to work. So they went back and created a system which essentially is a statewide property tax. There are two taxes, but both of them are controlled by the state. So you are told what to levy as a school district. You send that money up to the state. The state then tells you how much money you get back. Mm-hmm. The only local funding that you can do has to do with special education and technology. Otherwise, everything is dictated at the state level. This was more done as a way to reduce property taxes than to fund schools, but it creates this equity. What you hear is exactly kind of what you're talking about. There are districts in Michigan that have wanted to spend more. They want to have all these kind of extra services and things for their kids, but they're not allowed to. And they've been pushing for that to happen. We used to see this with lawsuits that were filed for equity, that they would come in and school district would sue and say it's unequal. The courts would say, okay, we agree with you, and then the state would just bring the top down and the very bottom up, and they'd create equality. The people who sued thought, no, we'll all be equally wealthy. And the state said, no, you'll just all be equal. Bringing the top down, I don't know how that adds to kids' education if you're choosing to spend it locally. So this idea of that you're talking about in Tennessee, and we're seeing it in other places, worry about what is adequate. What is the dollar amount you need to get all of your kids up to state standards, at least to state standards? Come up with that adequate number, and if you want to go beyond adequate and that's your own funding, go ahead and do that. We don't do that with anything else in government, right? We wouldn't say you're only allowed to have 2 fire department or 2 fire trucks or whatever in your city. We don't limit people. If you want to spend more, you can spend more, but make sure everybody gets there. And in Virginia, you have districts that are not there, and they don't have the local wealth to get anywhere near there. So that's what you're talking about, is this huge difference. And we see that is much more of an issue actually for the East Coast and in the Northeast. When you look at places like New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, they have these huge, Illinois, they have these huge differences in lowest spending to highest spending. And while we see it in every state, it really is a Northeast type.
All right, and our last question.
Hi, my name's Delilah, and I'm a math educator, middle school math educator in Baltimore City. And I'm also working on my doctorate at Northeastern University. And I'm studying school choice. And Baltimore City operates under a compulsory high school choice system. And my question is specifically for Michael. In my research, I have found that in Baltimore, choice is associated with poorer outcomes for the most vulnerable kids. We're seeing that it's working for students that are already more affluent, and that high school placement is strongly tied to income. So my question is, have you studied this as part of your research with the Learning Policy Institute? And what is your position on voucher programs, choice programs, how they impact equity for students living in the most concentrated levels of poverty?
Wow, that's loaded. So let's start with the research. When you see choice, and especially when choice is not combined with transportation, you see this separation where the kids that can go somewhere do go somewhere. And that's choice within a district, or it's open enrollment programs from district to district, or it's charter schools. Whenever those things are offered without transportation, then the families that can afford tend to leave, and you see this coalescing of the families who have the ability to do these things in certain schools, and then the kids who can't move in others. And that's an issue. And that's when you start to see these huge, gaps in choice, that they become these self-selecting things. As far as sort of choice goes, choice makes a lot of sense, but you've got to balance it, and you've got to understand that it will impact your finances. So for instance, in the state of Michigan, we just talked about them, they have an open enrollment policy where people can come and go and leave. The Flint School District, people have chosen to leave. And it's almost all the middle class and upper middle class families go to and send their kids to neighboring school districts. The Flint School District now has 90% of their kids are at risk, and 40% of their kids who are special ed. So the kids who are in the Flint district are the ones who cannot leave. What that's created is a school that isn't great for any of the kids who are there. They receive less and less funding. They have the same number of school buildings, so what they're forced to do is cut down on the number of school buildings, cut down on the number of services. So not only do you have this kind of disproportionate number of high-need kids, you have a place that's being forced to cut as they go along. You have to take that into account. Whenever you offer choice and you're offering greater opportunities and a larger number of schools, you have to look at that and realize there's going to be some financial impact. You also have to offer transportation and some ability for those kids who are there to go to other places. So that's the hardest thing. Now with vouchers, there are multiple ways you can do vouchers. And in some states, the voucher program is offered to kids who are currently in public schools, and those schools were failing and they could choose to go to a private school. That will have some financial impact on the traditional public schools over time. There are other states that just now have started to have voucher programs where all students are qualified, even if you've never attended a public school once. In those programs, any kid taking a voucher who had not attended a public school is now producing a cost that had never existed before. And if the money is coming from the ed department, it can quickly move a lot of your resources over to these kids who had not received these services before. You can argue about what's right and what's not right, but I can simply tell you from a financial standpoint, that's an issue that you need to look at and address. And we're just starting to see those programs, so I can't give you a lot of good data around that. Arizona is one of the first to kind of adopt this. West Virginia has a similar system. Iowa's new system will be something like that. So we'll get a better understanding of what the financial impact, but it's just by definition. If you weren't included before and you are included now, you're a new cost and the money's got to come from somewhere. So.
All right, well, that's all for us today. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference here. Thanks.